Mr Nosey by Roger Hargreaves. Mr Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr Nosey was the sort of a person who, if they came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr Nosey was the sort of a person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr Nosey was the sort of a person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all, but did that stop Mr Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Mr Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people of Tiddletown decided that Mr Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. "We must find some way of stopping him being so nosy," said old Mr Chips, the town carpenter. "That's right," said Mrs Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. "He needs to be taught a lesson." "If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything," said Mr Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. "Listen," he said, now grinning. "I have a plan." All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning Mr Nosey was out walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash! Went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mr Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day Mr Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and standing on tiptoe he looked over the wall. Snap! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mrs Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street, feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day Mr Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeped round. Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said old Mr Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day Mr Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and he crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr Herd the farmer. When he saw that Mr Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing: a sore nose. Mr Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves. This is Coldland, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Coldland is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing, and when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So you can imagine how cold it is. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody who lives there is cold as well. You can tell if somebody comes from Coldland because everybody there has a red nose. And people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. Achoo! The sound of the sneeze is very common indeed in Coldland, which is not very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr Sneeze, who lived in a small, snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning, Mr Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing. I don't like this sneezing all the time, he thought to himself every day, until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try to find a cure for the sneezes. So that very same day, Mr Sneeze packed the things he'd need for his journey, mainly handkerchiefs. He sneezed, locked his front door, sneezed, and set off. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Coldland, and then he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days, until Coldland was far behind him. As he walked away from Coldland, he noticed that there was less and less snow, and eventually he walked so far that there was no snow at all. And as he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing, he was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not a bit. Not at all. Not even the tiniest tissue. I wonder why I'm not sneezing, he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself, because a voice behind him replied, "You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold." Mr Sneeze jumped, turned, and there behind him stood a wise old wizard. "What's a cold?" asked Mr Sneeze. "A cold is what you catch when you're too cold," said the wise old wizard wisely. "Oh," said Mr Sneeze, "but I come from a country called Coldland, where everybody is too cold all the time." "Nonsense," snorted the wizard. "It can't be too cold all the time because of the sun," and he pointed to the sun which was smiling in the sky. "But we don't have any sun in Coldland," said Mr Sneeze. "No sun?" exclaimed the wizard. "How extremely, extraordinarily extraordinary! We'd better do something about that then, hadn't we?" "Yes," agreed Mr. Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about. "How far away is this place called Coldland?" asked the wizard. "Oh, it's miles and miles and miles away," replied Mr. Sneeze. "In which direction?" asked the wizard. Mr. Sneeze pointed. "Shouldn't take long," said the wizard, who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both the wizard and Mr. Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which you will remember is the capital of Coldland. As usual, it was snowing. "I say, this is a cold, gloomy place," said the wizard. "A tissue," replied Mr. Sneeze, who had started sneezing again. "Coldland certainly needs some sunshine," said the wizard, "and that's going to take some rather special magic." "Please hurry," said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman. "Now," said the wizard, ignoring him, "I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards." The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some more magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. "Ha-tissue, ha-tissue, ha-tissue," sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then, quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind that big black cloud, and it stopped snowing. "There now," said the wizard, "that should stop the sneezing." And then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting to even say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. After that, the sun shone every day, and today Coldland isn't anything like it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice anymore. And these days the sound of the sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. And that isn't the only thing that is different about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? It happened one other time too. See if you can find the page where that was. His nose wasn't red anymore. Mr. Bump by Roger Hargreaves. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he couldn't help having these little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken, or splintered or chipped or snapped, or cracked or torn, or burst or wrenched, or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch up to it again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So he set off to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach, he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that is where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples. But he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no. Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking up apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump. And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good.